Well, thanks so much for having me tonight. I hope that this will be an interesting, compelling topic for you. I'm sure that this is not going to be brand new to most of you. Given your work that you do, you're probably very knowledgeable about human trafficking, but I want to hopefully talk about this topic in a way that challenges us to maybe challenge others in our communities to really make a difference on this issue. So I work for Catholic Charities here in Louisville. We have a statewide human trafficking program. We work with a coalition of agencies to really accomplish three purposes: to develop statewide action in Kentucky, to affect change in human trafficking, to educate and train community members, professionals about human trafficking in order to better identify cases. And then the third big part of what we do is direct victim services. So at Catholic Charities here, we serve victims of human trafficking throughout the state of Kentucky, except for the northern part of Kentucky near Cincinnati, where they have another service agency that provides a lot of those services there. So what I thought we might do is talk a little bit about what I mean when I say human trafficking, to sort of make sure we're all on the same page, and share with you some terminology and some statistics. And you also have a lot of resources in front of you, and I'll talk about what some of those are so that you know what you have in front of you. I thought it would also be helpful to give some case examples, some from our work here in Kentucky, but maybe some others from other parts of the country. And then to also talk about what you can do in your work in social justice to effect change, maybe through programming, different community organizing, and other ways that you can sort of challenge folks around you to make a difference in this issue. Feel free to ask questions as we go. I'm happy for you to stop me and say, what about this? Or we also will have time at the end for some questions. Kim has kindly offered to have a microphone, and so if you will just let her know so that before you start asking the question, maybe she can get the mic in front of you. Or if you feel more comfortable just jotting down questions as we go and asking them at the end, that's fine too. So when we talk about the term human trafficking, we often liken it to modern day slavery, because the idea is that individuals who are being trafficked, they're not free to choose to leave the situation that they're in. They're being exploited and controlled, and they're not free to choose not to participate in those activities. And so we liken it to modern day slavery. We sort of say human trafficking and modern day slavery. And we know that this is an international problem, just like Kim said. We know it's happening all over the world. We often don't recognize how much it's happening in our own communities. So I'll focus more on the trafficking that we're seeing in our communities this evening. A shocking statistic I learned when I started doing this work a few years ago: human trafficking is the second largest criminal industry in the world, second only to drug trafficking. What I mean is it's making more money than any other crime in the world except for drugs. When I heard that, I was shocked, because I thought, you know, we're inundated with information about the problem with drugs. We hear about it all the time. It's not a shock to any of us that we have a big problem with drugs worldwide. Shocking to me that no second to that is buying and selling people and exploiting them for commercial sex and labor. The CIA estimates that human trafficking is probably a $28 billion a year business, and that's probably a conservative estimate. Human trafficking is estimated to right now be tied in second place with arms dealing, buying and selling weapons, as the second largest international crime. However, among those three crimes, trafficking drugs, trafficking people, and trafficking weapons, human trafficking is estimated to be the most quickly growing. Experts in the field believe that if it continues to grow at the rate that it is, it will eventually surpass drug trafficking and become the largest criminal industry in the world. And you know, I think that's because it's so lucrative in nature. It's making so much money for traffickers. Matter of fact, I think you can make more money trafficking people than you can trafficking drugs and weapons, to an extent. Let me give you an example of why that would be true. When you traffic a drug, like you have so many kilos of cocaine or pounds of marijuana, and you sell that drug to someone, You can only sell that drug once. You make your money once. You have to replenish your supply to keep profiting in that business. And the same is true with weapons. If you have a gun, you can sell that gun one time. You have to replenish your supply to keep profiting in that business. But if you have a person and you're exploiting that person for commercial sex or labor, that person is resellable for the services that you're acquiring of them. So for the trafficker, you don't have to replace your product as often, right? When do you have to replace your product? Well, if your victim dies, or if they escape, right? Or they're rescued. Otherwise, you keep exploiting the same people over and over again. And let me give you an example of how lucrative this crime is. And I do apologize, the examples will be somewhat ugly, but I don't think there's really any way to take the ugly out of human trafficking. So let me give you an example about the lucrative nature of this crime. Let's say we have a 15-year-old girl who's being trafficked for sex. So her pimp, who is her trafficker, oftentimes a pimp is also a trafficker, her pimp is going to make her service a man for, let's say, 30 minutes at a time. During those 30 minutes, she has to do anything that this man wants, and he's going to pay the bargain price of $100 for her 30 minutes. Now that money is going to go in the pocket of the pimp, of the trafficker. She's probably not going to get any of that money. Now let's say on average, he makes her do this with 10 men a day. So he's making around $1,000 in one day off of one 15-year-old. Now, he's probably making her do it 7 days a week because she's not going to get a day off. Right, so 7 days a week, $1,000 a day. I'm a social worker, so I'm not great at the math, but that's just under $10,000 in 1 week off of one 15-year-old. Now, in most of these sex trafficking rings, brothels, prostitution rings, whatever you want to call them, usually there's not just one girl being sold. Usually there's a variety of girls, sometimes minors, sometimes adults, of different ethnicities, different demographics. Another shocking statistic that I learned during this work, the average age of entry into prostitution in the United States of America today is 13 years old. 13. The likelihood that adult women that we come across in our communities were trafficked as children is very, very high. But let's go back to this example. So let's say there's not just one 15-year-old being sold by this man, but let's say there's a couple of 11 and 12-year-olds. Because if 13 is the average, that means there's girls as young as 8 and 9 and 10 being sold for sex. So a couple of 11 and 12-year-olds, a couple of 13 and 14-year-olds, and a few 15, 16, and 17-year-olds. Let's say a total of 10 girls being sold by this one trafficker. And he's making just under $10,000 per girl per week. And he knows he can sell them week after week after week until what? Until they escape, until they die, until someone rescues them, or until they become so sick from disease that they're not helpful to him anymore, right? So do you see the extraordinary amount of money that's being made? Now, labor trafficking is just as lucrative, but the money's maybe made a little bit differently. In most labor trafficking cases, you have a company or an employer who is taking advantage of the labor services of their workers. So let's take the example of a restaurant. Say you have a restaurant owner. He has a little small business. He has maybe 20 employees. Okay. The overhead costs that most employers have, especially at a restaurant, would be, the cost of the goods that they're using to make the food, rent, utilities, and usually the biggest overhead cost is the salaries of the employees. And then what you have left over after paying all of that is your profit as a business owner. So imagine that this owner of this restaurant who has 20 employees, imagine he's not paying his workers at all for their services. Now, if they're minimum wage workers working full time, they should be making, somewhere around $15,000, $20,000 a year, maybe, right? And he's not paying any of that, and he's got 20 employees. So do you see how he's saving hundreds of thousands of dollars by not paying his workers? Now, in some labor trafficking cases, the workers are paid a very small amount. So let's say maybe he's paying them $2 or $3 an hour. he's still saving hundreds of thousands of dollars by not properly paying those workers. So in both types of trafficking, it's usually very, very lucrative for the trafficker. So I just want you to see that that's why I think it's growing at such exponential rates. The profit is so high, and the risk of getting caught is really low. You know, you're gonna make a lot of money trafficking drugs, right? But the risk of getting caught is getting pretty high. Well, so why don't you traffic people instead? Because the profit is just as high, and the risk is a lot lower. So here in the United States, we have by statute 2 types of trafficking, which I've already mentioned. We have labor trafficking and we have sex trafficking by law. Now in other countries, they include other things like organ trafficking and buying and selling children. Other countries might define that as trafficking. That's of course illegal here, but it's not covered under our trafficking statutes, right? Organ trafficking is not okay, but it's covered under a different law. Buying and selling children would be covered under illegal adoptions, right? So what I'm going to talk about today with you is sex trafficking and labor trafficking. The exception, I think, and maybe someone can help me out, is I think the state of Washington recently passed a state law that now makes organ trafficking part of the state trafficking statute in Washington. Anybody here from Washington that can tell me about that? Okay. Well, I believe that's the only exception to the organ trafficking is the state of Washington. So in regards to sex trafficking, if you'll just look with me at the definition for just a minute, notice that sex trafficking includes only commercial sexual activities. That's really important. I want you all to leave today feeling empowered to know what would or wouldn't be considered trafficking and to feel like you can share that information well with others. Sex trafficking must be commercial in nature for it to even be potentially trafficking. Let me also say, before I go farther on that, when I train law enforcement in particular, I think the idea of identifying trafficking cases is somewhat overwhelming. You know, how will I know if it's trafficking or not? So I usually say, human trafficking is basically a 2-part crime. You've got part A and you've got part B. So if you see part A, look for part B, and if you have both of those, you probably have a trafficking case. So this is part A. Do you see that someone is being exploited for commercial sex or for labor? This is part A. By commercial sex, I mean any sex act in exchange for something of commercial value. So it's actually maybe broader than what we might initially think. Usually the first thing that comes to mind is prostitution, right? Because we usually think of sex in exchange for money, and that certainly is commercial sex, but it's not the only sex act that we would consider commercial. So what if you exchange sex for drugs instead of money? Is that still a commercial sex act? Well, yeah, because drugs have a commercial value, right? Similarly, you can exchange something that's not actually sex per se. What about dancing, like stripping? It's a sexual act, and it's usually exchanged for money. So that's considered a commercial sex act. So for this definition of commercial sex, we typically include 4 types of activity. Prostitution, pornography, right? Because pornography is sexual acts on video or in books or whatever in exchange for usually money. Stripping and escorting. These escort services where you're selling sexual services, oftentimes it's a mask for prostitution. Okay, so it's maybe broader than just that narrow definition of prostitution that we think about. Labor trafficking can be any sort of labor or service. It's not specific to only certain kinds of industries, although there are some that are high risk. And I'll mention some of those maybe as we go throughout the evening, and I think we have a question right here in the middle. You're going to keep me on my toes tonight. That's my next slide. So if I don't answer that, bring it up again, okay? Very good point. So this is part A. Do you see someone being trafficked for sex or for labor, okay? The next thing that you look for is the presence of control. That's part B. That's what differentiates trafficking from a whole host of other crimes, right? This person is not free to leave. And our statute, our federal statute, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, we call it the TVPA, it outlines specifically these 3 types of control: the use of force, or fraud, or coercion. to maintain control of the victim. That's why we liken it to modern day slavery, because with these forms of control used against the victim, they're really not free to leave. So let me break these down for you. When we talk about force, we're talking about physical force, assaulting someone, raping someone, locking them into a house or an apartment that they can't get out of, right? Physically holding them in a space. Also, drug taking is a method of force that might not seem quite as obvious, and we see this in so many trafficking cases, the use of drugs. So a couple of clients of mine, 2 Latina girls, one was only 15 at the time, they were trafficked into the Metro Louisville area, and they were brought to a local hotel. I think some of you all tomorrow are going to Centro Latino, right, in Shelbyville? Yeah, so these girls were brought to sort of that area of Kentucky, Shelby County, to a hotel, and in that hotel they were brought to a restaurant. In that restaurant, at the hotel, the trafficker gave them a drink, and without their knowledge, he put a drug in it. And once they were drugged, he then took them to a hotel room where he sexually assaulted them both. And then he made them work at a local hotel here in Louisville, cleaning the rooms. And he would drive them back and forth and take their paycheck. And he kept the 15-year-old living with him at his house and sexually assaulted her on a regular basis. So you can see different methods of force, right? A variety of force. But what was the first method of force? Well, he drugged them because it was much easier to assault them once they were drugged. Right? A couple of other clients of mine, American teenage girls. One was trafficked in the Lexington area, which is an urban area about an hour and a half from here, and the other one was trafficked here in Louisville. Both of these girls were about 15 or 16 years old at the time. And this man, who acted like an older boyfriend to them, introduced them to drugs, got them hooked on drugs, became their drug supplier, and convinced them that they could make good money working at a local strip club, dancing. So once he has them hooked on drugs and has them dancing in the club, he then forces them to prostitute in the club and to other people in the community outside the clubs, right? But the drugs were a major way that he controlled these girls. So even though drugs don't seem as obvious as maybe rape, it's just as controlling, and we see it a lot in these cases. A couple of years ago, I was doing some training with the Lexington Police Department, and in one of my classes, a police officer said that he got a call when he was on patrol a few years ago to respond to a gas station in downtown Lexington, which is a very urban area. And when he gets to the gas station, it was about midnight or 1 in the morning. When he got there, he saw a naked Latina woman in the parking lot of the gas station, completely naked. She looked terrified. He had no idea what had happened to her, but he approached the woman and he tried to explain to her, I want to help you. I don't want to hurt you. I need you to help me understand what's happened. Of course, there was a language barrier because she only spoke Spanish. But the woman took the officer down this main road, Broadway, just a few blocks down from the gas station to an apartment building, and inside the building to a specific apartment. And when the officer entered the apartment, he found about 9 more naked Latina women, and they were tied to beds. And they were forced to prostitute to migrant workers in the Lexington area. We have a lot of migrant workers on our farms, working with horses, tobacco, that sort of thing. So when the officer entered, obviously this is prostitution, right? But the question he had to ask himself is, do I arrest these women and charge them with prostitution because they are in fact prostituting? Well, it didn't appear they were complicit because they were tied to the beds, right? And we now know that would be considered sex trafficking. So sometimes the force is really obvious, like ropes and things, or sometimes it's drugs, which is a little less obvious but just as controlling. The second method of of control that we see in trafficking cases is fraud. We see this a lot in cases involving foreign national victims, folks brought here from other countries. Anyone guess for me what the fraud is? What is the lie or deception that a lot of these foreign nationals are told to come to the United States? Any guesses? Work, right? If you come to the United States of America, you can get a good job, you can make a living, and have the American dream. Matter of fact, I'll help you do it because I own a restaurant, I own a construction company, right? Whatever. And I need you to come work for me. I'll even pay for your travel, because I know you don't have any money. You can pay me back later. Well, when it's a trafficking case, Once that person comes into the United States, they're much more vulnerable now, right? How are they more vulnerable once they get here? Right, maybe someone took their passport. That often happens. Any identity documents they had, whether they're true or false, are usually taken from them. What else? What's that? Oh yeah, they owe them money. They already have a debt, right? And they're told, you have to pay this debt off to me, right? So that's a vulnerability. What else? Yeah, they don't have any family or friends near them, so who are they going to ask for help from, right? Because they don't know anybody. Over here? Language. They probably don't speak English very much, if at all. Yeah, so there's these cultural stigmas, right? Where if they find out someone was having sex, before they're married, they're going to be ostracized in their home country. Sure. Geographically, they don't know where they are. They could be in California or Kentucky. Where are they going to go for help? In their home country, maybe police are not trustworthy. So they're not going to trust police that they're going to help them. All these vulnerabilities. So it's not by mistake that traffickers prey on foreign nationals. But there's a lot of fraud. They're told conditions will be a certain way when they get here. They'll get a certain type of job. And that turns out not to be true, and they're not free to leave, right? We see a lot of fraud in domestic cases. An older boyfriend saying, I'll provide for you what your family never did. I'll love you like your dad never did. It'll just be you and me. We'll have our own little family. He doesn't tell her he's going to sell her for sex every day, right? She goes with him believing that this is going to be a better life for her. So we see a lot of fraud. The third method of control is coercion. Threats, mind games, shame tactics. The idea is not that they follow through on the threat, but that the threat is very controlling, right? A threat we see a lot with foreign nationals is, I'm sure you can guess, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to report you to immigration. I'm going to have you deported. What do you think about that? If you don't do what I say, I'm going to call the police and have you thrown in jail. Who's going to feed your children then, right? Another threat that we see a lot is the threat of harm to their family. I know that you have children. I know where your parents are. They're going to be in danger if you don't do what I say. You better not cause problems for me. Or it could be threat against their own their own personal well-being. They might say, you think things have been bad? Things can get worse. Try escaping and see what happens to you. Or they might hurt other victims in front of them as an example of what not to do. So one client of mine who is from the Caribbean, she was sold by her parents when she was 10, and she was given to a woman and made to be a domestic servant in her home, cooking and cleaning all day, taking care of the woman's son, who was about 8 years old. She wasn't allowed to go to school. She wasn't allowed to leave the house except to fetch water a couple times a day, and she was forced to sleep on a floor in the back of the house. She was kept in these conditions from the age of 10 to 15, during which time she was regularly abused by the woman and by the boy. They burnt her with cigarettes, cut her with knives. She has scars all over her that I see when I meet with her. She wears a short sleeve shirt. I'll see different scars, or if her neckline changes, I'll see scars from the abuse. When the girl turned 15, the woman changed this girl's name, got her a passport in this new name, and brought her to Newark, New Jersey. New York City, anyone here from that area? Newark, New Jersey, New York. So she was brought to that area and she was kept there for a few months in this woman's house. And then she was moved to Connecticut. Anyone from Connecticut here? So she was kept in Connecticut, locked in a house for 2 years as a domestic servant. And then she was moved to Miami. Anyone here from Florida? So she was held in Miami for about a year and a half. And then her final destination was LaGrange, Kentucky, which is just outside of Louisville. She was held there for about a year and a half. So by this time, this girl's 20, almost 21 years old. And she's been a domestic servant for about 11 years. Locked in houses, made to clean, cook. So as I've been working with this girl for the past few years, she tells me a little bit more about what happened to her. And she told me that every family member, because this was one family that trafficked her, moving her around from one family member to another. And they were all from her country in the Caribbean. She said that every family member that she lived with, they would always tell her the same thing. They would say to her, don't forget, we're from your country, and we know the village where your parents live. And we know that you have 2 younger sisters. And if you escape, we're going to replace you with one of them. Is that what you want for your sister? Don't you want a better life for them? I mean, you can leave, but how selfish of you would that be? What kind of choice is there in that? You know, who knows if they would have followed through on that threat, but that threat was very controlling for her, right? It kept her from trying to leave for at least 11 years. So for it to be a trafficking case, you don't have to have all 3 methods of control. You don't have to have force and fraud and coercion. You only have to have one. One method of control along with that exploitation for commercial sex or labor. Now my experience has been, and those of you in the room who've dealt with trafficking also probably have had a similar experience where in most cases they use a variety of control. Multiple methods of force and fraud and coercion. Why do they do that? Why do they control in lots of ways? Well, because they don't want that victim to escape, right? It keeps them more vulnerable, certainly. Using different methods of control keeps them vulnerable, not knowing what to expect. And when you keep that victim vulnerable, it keeps them from trying to escape. And why don't they want them to escape? Well, because that's money that they're not making, right? And it's all about money and control. And if they escape, there's a chance that that trafficker might get caught. And we said the issue right now is that the profit's high and the risk is low. They don't want this to be a high-risk business. So if they control that victim in lots of ways, it's less likely they'll get away. Now, as you so kindly brought up earlier, there is an exception under the definition of sex trafficking, which I want to make sure we all know and are very clear about. This is an exception to the rule of control. Any commercial sex act involving a minor, someone under the age of 18, is automatically considered sex trafficking of that minor. A minor cannot consent to commercial sexual activity. It's assumed they're being induced by someone who's exploiting them. So what does that mean? That means there's no such thing as a 15-year-old prostitute. It means you have a 15-year-old commercially sexually exploited child, right? She's a victim, not a criminal. The question is who's victimizing her? Who's exploiting her? Well, probably a pimp or a trafficker. Who's buying her? They're culpable, right? Not too long ago, we found a 14-year-old girl stripping in a club in Lexington. 14 years old stripping. As the investigation went on, they found out her aunt was the one driving her back and forth to the club and taking her money. So the aunt was certainly culpable. We have a question or a comment, I think, back here. Would you raise your hand again? So just know that any minor involved in those commercial sexual activities we talked about earlier, prostitution, pornography, escorting, stripping, automatically considered a sex trafficking victim regardless of the presence of control. Now usually there's control in those cases too, right? Usually. But regardless, if you know that there's a 14-year-old in a club stripping, sex trafficking. If you know someone who's under the age of 18 is involved in prostitution-related activities, victim of trafficking, yes.
Hi, thank you. Appreciate your conversation so far. Just a couple of points that are coming to my mind in personally doing research on sex work in the States and abroad. One is that there are also males and boys who are part of this too. And then there are police officers who will rape women who are sex workers or ask for whatever sexual services and still arrest them. So there are people in positions of authority who are also culpable of this abuse and oppression and violence. And then the people who are the step above the traffickers, who the traffickers are answering to, so just going up the chain. So those two things there. And also, in the sex worker world, there are transgender people, so male and female transgenders, and female and male transgenders, who are incredibly oppressed in this field. so I just want to also give voice to them.
Very good points. Thank you. Okay. Which leads me to the next question that people often ask is, who might be a victim of trafficking? Who might we need to look out for that might be vulnerable? Well, in a general way, traffickers prey on vulnerability. They look for a vulnerability that's exploitable, and you did so well pointing out what some of those are. Oftentimes, a person's vulnerability might just be their age, or their gender, right? Or their sexual orientation. Traffickers will prey on a vulnerability and try to find a way to exploit it. Now, the asterisks on the screen indicate that there are certain trends that we see. So let me talk about what some of those are. Internationally, trafficking victims tend to more oftentimes be female. It's estimated that about 80% of trafficking victims worldwide are female adults or female children. So women and female girls are trafficked at a very high rate for both sex and for labor trafficking. It's estimated that about 50% of trafficking victims worldwide are children. Children also trafficked for both sex and for labor. Now, we do have male victims of trafficking. Men tend to be more often trafficked for labor, for work in construction, restaurants, farm work, a variety of labor forces. Although we do have men that are trafficked for sex, in particular young boys and teenagers, and I think gay, lesbian youth are particularly high risk. Here in Kentucky, a couple years ago, we had an 11-year-old boy in the care of, I believe, foster parents who both raped and sodomized him. The mom and the dad did, and they sold him to men in the community in exchange for drugs and money. Right, so boys and men can also be victims of sex trafficking. We see that here in the United States, we do have a problem with foreign national trafficking, which is what we tend to talk about the most. The State Department estimates that 14,000 to 17,000 foreign nationals are brought into the United States every year from countries all over the world. That's a pretty astonishing number. However, we also have this problem with domestic trafficking. That's the trafficking of Americans. Who do you think domestically is highest risk for being trafficked? Sorry? Runaways? Okay. Anybody else? The homeless? Foster children, I hear a theme, and that is young people, right? Children seem to be the highest risk domestically for being trafficked. There's not a lot of research that's been done on domestic trafficking, but the little research that's out there estimates that up to 300,000 American children are trafficked every year in our communities. That's an astonishingly high number, I think, and that's probably a conservative estimate. You should have a handout, I think, in front of you. It's that cream-colored one right there. It says, Facts at a Glance, Domestic Minor Sex Trafficking, has some shocking statistics about the trafficking of children and teenagers in our community. That's where they have the statistic about 13 being the average age of entry into prostitution. So I encourage you to read that as you get time. But we know that children, teenagers, in particular homeless, runaway teens and youth who have maybe a history of abuse and violence are particularly vulnerable to exploitation. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children estimates that 1 in 7 children runs away from home at some point. 1 in 7. The majority of them return home the same day. For those who don't, it's likely they'll be approached within their first 2 days on the street by someone who wants to exploit them. Usually that exploitation looks something like this. So you don't have a place to stay? It's getting pretty cold outside. I'll tell you what, you can come stay with me if you'll do this. Are you getting pretty hungry? Well, I'll tell you what, I'll get you something to eat if you'll do this. Right, offering something that child or that teenager needs to survive in exchange for something sexual, which makes it commercial sex, right? That commercial exchange can be money, drugs, food, shelter, medication, gifts, jewelry, anything that has a commercial value. According to the National Center if a child or teenager is away from home, on the street, or homeless or couch jumping for 3 months, 90% of them, virtually all of them, will participate in what they call survival sex. They'll exchange something sexual for something they need to survive. So that shows us how high risk these kids are to being exploited. Was there a question or comment? Yeah.
What category you would put the people that now is dating, you know, on the computer, they date through the computer, and then they bring women from other countries in the pretense that they're going to marry them, that they're going to give them this and that and that other. Then when they get here, then what they become is their sexual partner, and they come into a domestic violence. What category are they human trafficking?
Yeah, so the question is about women from other countries in particular who might meet a man, usually an American man, online. We call those mail order brides. I guess the more appropriate term is internet order bride, right, these days? Yeah, so that by itself is not trafficking because marriage brokers are completely legal. What we see is that those women are high risk for being trafficked. So if that man has bad intentions, and we've had a couple of mail order bride cases here in Kentucky where it ended up being trafficking, they're in a position that's so vulnerable that it's somewhat easy to exploit them. So in the cases we've had here, one woman was made to make videos and things that he sold online, sexual videos, right? The other one was made to be a domestic slave and a sex slave, really. So she wasn't free to leave the house and she had to work all day and work in his business with no pay and no access to finances, right? And she wasn't free to leave. So that's certainly high risk for trafficking. By itself, it's not, but it's high risk. Certainly, it makes those women particularly vulnerable. Okay, so the common, oh, sorry, read some more questions over here.
I have a question about, so if a person is under 18, then they are deemed to be victims. Do you have a lot of resistance from law enforcement? Because my guess is that many of the victims, victims of sex trade, they may say, they don't have a PIN, or they don't, they're because of their duress and their fear, they may just claim that somebody's forcing them to do that. So I can imagine that law enforcement might be reluctant to do all that investigative work and everything. Do you have a problem with that? Do they have a problem with that?
Yes. Yes, so there's a big, there's a divide between what law enforcement might call a child sex trafficking case and what we know is child sex trafficking, because law enforcement, to an extent, has to go on facts and evidence and what's being told to them. And if you have a minor, and this frequently happens, I think the estimate I heard was 90-something% of girls who are being trafficked for sex deny they have a pimp. And 90-something% of these girls have a pimp, right? So they're being trafficked. Either they don't know they're being trafficked, right? They don't know that that's what's happening. They think they're in control. Or they just don't want to see that he's exploiting them. They believe he really loves them, right? It's much like a domestic violence relationship where you might have these feelings of love for that person and so you're conflicted. But in the services programs, it's so important that despite what happens with law enforcement, if we screen them and know that they were trafficked, we provide them services, whether or not the case is investigated and prosecuted as trafficking, because it often goes uninvestigated and unprosecuted, and that's a common problem, even with adult victims.
Questions. Do you know what country has the most trafficked individuals? And then secondly, I read a statistic a few years ago, and I just want to confirm whether or not it's still true or affirm, or if it was true at all, if what I read was not accurate. But I had read that U.S. citizens, in particular U.S. males, provide the largest market for sex trafficking across the world.
Okay, part one. It's hard to know exactly the numbers of victims. On the stuff you'll see on your table, it often says look beneath the surface. We call this a hidden crime because it happens so much and it's never identified. From what we have identified cases, it's estimated that India has the highest number of trafficking victims, both for sex and for labor in India. Now, Southeast Asia, Thailand, Cambodia, those areas are estimated to have really high instances of sex trafficking in particular. But India, I've heard and read, seems to have a lot of both. Who knows if that's really accurate, because again, it's so hidden, but based, I think, on what has been able to be researched, that's what I hear. Part two. What was part two of your question? Oh, the market, yes. This is a demand-driven issue. Human trafficking for labor or for sex is completely demand-driven. So the question is it American men? Well, we know that this costs money, especially the sex industry. You have to have money to spend. And so the countries that have a better economy and have money to spend are probably more likely to participate to an extent. And we know that it's oftentimes men purchasing women for commercial sex as opposed to the reverse. Now, not always, but more often. And so I guess in short, I'd have to say, yes, it's oftentimes men that push the sex industry and participate in commercial sex, including sex trafficking. They drive the demand. It's not necessarily only American men. I would say it's men from countries where the economy is good in such a way that they're able to do that. Now, labor trafficking, I have to say, we're all culpable. I can't say that there's anyone in particular, and I'll talk more about that, but it's related to the issue of fair trade and and consumerism and those things. So many of us, even without knowing, are somewhat connected to the issue of labor trafficking. But for the sex industry, I would say certainly the demand tends to be men for women's and children's bodies for sex in a general way. Yes?
What percentage of these girls or boys are already addicted to drugs when they're asked to perform whatever they do?
So the question is, how many of these women or these girls and boys are already addicted to drugs? I don't think we have a hard percentage. I don't know of research that's been done to give us an exact number. I do know that if they have a history of exposure to drugs or violence or abuse, they're higher risk for being abused. But I also know that in a lot of cases, they're introduced to drugs during their trafficking, or they self-medicate with drugs to live through the experience. So drugs seem to be a huge factor in multiple ways. I'll take one more question, and then if you don't mind, I'll go on a little bit. Go ahead.
So the question I asked is how to get a good how do you eventually get them? How do they get escape?
Okay, so the question is, how do they escape and how do they get to me? Third-party referrals. I tend to not ID the victims myself, and they don't self-identify. I've never had someone come to me and say, I'm a trafficking victim, can you help me? Because they don't know that that's what's happened to them, right? Or they don't know the terminology. So that's why it's so important that you all know how to ID cases, because it's folks like you that report cases to me. We get referrals from law enforcement, healthcare workers, social service providers, folks who work with at-risk youth, and we call Good Samaritan referrals, folks who live in the community, church members who notice something is going on and report that. So if you can imagine some of the scenarios that I've sort of given to you, you can imagine trafficking victims have a lot of needs, right? Their first need is to be rescued. After that, they have a host of other needs. They need to be safe. They usually need a place to stay, food, clothing. They probably have criminal legal issues, immigration legal issues. They might need interpretation, right? Medical care, mental health care. That's a lot. That's a lot of stuff. So it's really difficult for one agency or one individual to provide all of those things. But we try our best in our program to do that. So that's what you see on the screen now. That's what we're able to provide within our program at Catholic Charities here in Louisville. Partly because that's what we were initially funded to do, and we've maintained that standard as best we can, despite fluctuations in funding, but also because we know that that's best practice, and that's what these clients need. And so sometimes it's me begging people for free services, right? I'm pretty shameless. But I'll say, hey, listen, I paid you for such and such service with 3 victims. Can't you give me the 4th one for free? But we try to provide as many services as we can because we know that's what they need to really rebuild their lives. So I thought it would be helpful to maybe show you a little bit how it started at Catholic Charities, and I won't go through all of these, but basically it started with a simple training back in 2006 that our Director of Migration and Refugee Services, Darko Mihailovich, he attended, and he thought, we need to be doing this work. No doubt we have trafficking victims in Kentucky, which doesn't seem like an obvious place. Let me draw your attention then to this handout that you have on your tables. This is just some statistics on what we see in Kentucky. We put this together as a coalition. This is statewide data. We put this together with other agencies. So this is not just Catholic Charities of Louisville, it's our partner agencies also, of which there are 5. So over the past 4 years, we've identified 91 victims of trafficking in Kentucky, assisted 138, some of whom came from other states, and trained more than 16,000 folks. And then below that, you'll see a breakdown of the kinds of cases. You'll notice, disturbingly, that 53% of our victims were initially trafficked as children. I think that's a pretty astonishing and high number. Now, they might have been adults by the time they were rescued or escaped, but they were initially trafficked as children, 53% of them. So after our MRS director went to this training, he really felt impressed to try to have a program here, and with the support of leadership at Catholic Charities, pursued funding, and we got a per capita services contract through USCCB in 2007, which happened to be the same year we got a Kentucky state anti-trafficking statute passed. And we also applied for a federal rescue and restore regional grant for trafficking, which we did receive, and that was a 3-year grant. So we continued to build our program until 2011, when a lot of the funding went kaput. We lost a lot of federal funding. Many of you probably know why. Lots of political reasons revolving around funding religious organizations that won't provide the full range of health services. And so we're continuing our work with other funding and getting as creative as we can. So hopefully we all feel sort of like we know a little bit more about trafficking and what it would, or, what would or wouldn't be considered a trafficking case. And I hope that you feel compelled, I'm sure you do, to sort of do something to create change in this issue, and maybe you already have been. But if you're considering making a change in your community, what can I do personally in my position, or what can other people in my community do to make a difference? I just want to spend some time talking about that and hopefully give you some tools that might be helpful. I think the first question to ask is there a human trafficking program where you are? Are there folks in your area already doing trafficking work, right? Because if so, you should probably touch base with them, right? See what they're doing, see what services are not available, so that you're not just duplicating other services. Or maybe there already is shelter available, but there's not enough shelter, so you do need to duplicate that service and provide more. But I would say first, find out, do some research, what's happening in your area. How can you enhance what's already there? Or how can you start something for the first time? Does your state have a trafficking statute at the state level? Some states do. I think, what did I hear? 38 states do have a trafficking statute, but that leaves a small number of states that don't. And many states that do have a statute, it's not sufficient, and we're guilty as charged. Kentucky has a very basic state statute, enough to criminalize it, and that's about it. So we have a lot of advocacy work to do. And I saw that you've already been talking about advocating for legislative change. Check, right? That's a huge need in trafficking work. You've already been talking about poverty. That's so connected to the issue of trafficking and vulnerability. So you're already doing a lot of work and having discussions around these very connected issues. Are you in a position in your agency or your parish or your organization to provide direct services? If so, does trafficking fit into that in some way? Is there research in your area on trafficking? In Kentucky, we didn't have that. Back in 2007, we didn't know if trafficking was happening here. You always hear about it happening in Texas and New York and Florida, right? These big ports of immigration, very urban areas along the border. So we did some research. The University of Kentucky sponsored some research, and we've realized, yes, it is happening. We just didn't know how much. So maybe there's an issue around research that needs to be looked at. And do you have support from the leadership in your agency? Because that leadership is going to be really important to starting some sort of formal program. It was so necessary, and our agency and our leadership has been very, very supportive. So as we at Catholic Charities started talking about providing services, we decided to provide as many services as we could, and we were able to utilize other programs that we have. Now, we already have interpreters, so we can use those for our trafficking victims. We already have immigration legal services, so we can provide all of those things in-house. We have services for women and children. The only things that we didn't have are the ones that are circled. We don't provide medical care, we don't have in-house therapy and counseling, we don't provide shelter, and we don't provide criminal legal services. So we partner with other agencies in the community to provide those, and sometimes end up paying for that. The other issue that you might come across is the need for training and education. As I said, these cases are referred to me. Well, how do people know training or trafficking when they see it? They've somehow been trained or educated on the issue. So that's a huge challenge to start educating the community, even just the circle of friends around you or the coworkers that you have. A big issue that most folks are going to have in regards to starting a program or making a concerted effort in trafficking is the issue of funding, and that ain't an easy one. Right? There is some federal money available for trafficking through the form of grants for the most part. Health and Human Services sponsors the Rescue and Restore program, and they fund about, I think, six programs a year. The Office of Refugee Resettlement has the Per Capita Services program, which used to belong to USCCB, and it was recently given to other agencies, so Tapestry, Heartland Alliance, and another one. And that's contract services to provide, it's contract services work.
But that was even in light of the fact that USCCB contract was the best done of the 5-year review.
Yes, Sister Mary Schmuck brings up a very good point, and that's that there's new agencies that have that per capita services contract, but it was very well done by USCCB, and it was for purely political reasons that they don't have it anymore. So it's unfortunate we're sort of going backwards in regards to per capita services. Yes, they did that program very well. There's also some funding available through the Department of Justice. They have BJA grants for law enforcement. Service providers like us can get OVC grants through the Office for Victims of Crime to work with trafficking victims. There's research grants and also grants to work with youth, especially youth in the DJJ system. Then you should have some state funding. Now, it's actually federal money that's sort of funneled through the state, but it can be used for trafficking work. So VOCA, Victims of Crime Act, VAWA, Violence Against Women, those have historically been the funding sources for our domestic violence and sexual assault programs, but it completely fits in line with trafficking. So maybe for the first time, you all in your area need to make an application for a trafficking program to be funded in the same way, right? If you get denied the first time, just try again. It might make folks nervous to sort of expand beyond the DVSA stuff, but that can be a very good way to get some funding sort of from your state. And if your state has a statute, do they have funding attached to it? Here in Kentucky, we don't, so last legislative session, we advocated to now create a victims fund. And that fund would not be funded by taxes, it would be funded by property that's forfeited or seized by perpetrators, right, and sold at auction, and that money goes into the fund, appropriately so, right, goes back to the victims. And the other request that we made was that the fines be increased $10,000 per conviction on buying sex from a child. That seems appropriate to me. Actually, it should be higher than that. That $10,000 goes into the victims fund, right? Now that didn't pass last session, but we'll be presenting it again. So maybe that's a way to get some funding also in your area. We have a question, I think, up here. There's also some small JAG grants that often go through the states. Those are justice-based, so they usually are connected to law enforcement.
So I see on this fact sheet that there's 91 cases of human trafficking identified in Kentucky, and then right next to it, it says there's been 15 state and 2 federal indictments.
Yeah.
So when you talk about, getting convictions, and I see it that it's, roughly 1 in 6 convictions, if one conviction, or
It's that they don't get in the criminal justice system. Yeah, so the question is about the disconnect between the number of cases, 91 cases that we've had here, and then we've only had 17 charges or indictments, so a very small number. It's not any one reason alone, it's multiple reasons. Sometimes the victim does not want to participate in the justice process, and if they're an adult, they don't have to, right? For the most part. Sometimes they don't want to do it. They want to move past it. They're fearful. It's amazing how much control these victims truly believe those traffickers have, even when they're free. It's amazing and horrifying. So sometimes it's related to the victim not wanting to participate. Sometimes it's about training where it's not charged properly. So I recently went to a training here in Kentucky, and an assistant Commonwealth's attorney was doing the training, and she was talking about working sex crimes cases for children. And she didn't know who I was, and I didn't tell her who I was. But after the training, I went up to her and I said, you know, you work child sex abuse cases. I'm curious, how much trafficking do you see of those kids? She goes, you know, really, I don't see any trafficking cases because most of the kids are not from other countries, and they're not being moved around all the time. So then I said, oh, okay, well, do you see very many situations where like the kids are being exchanged by their parents in exchange for drugs and money and stuff or sex? She goes, oh, I see it all the time. And that's Assistant Commonwealth's attorney. I suspect that's not an isolated belief. So it's education, it's not knowing what the statute says and what would fall into that, not charging properly. And then there's the issue of playing it down. You know, some of our cases, you see there's been 17 indictments or charges. There's only been one conviction. Some of those will never be convictions on trafficking charges because they were amended down to unlawful transaction because they, you know, the attorneys, they want to get a guilty something, a conviction on something, better unlawful transaction than nothing. Yes?
Yes, we talked a little bit about education and some police involvement. My question is, are the police being trained to identify trafficking victims, and is there any federal mandate for training?
So the question is about the issue of training and whether or not it's mandated, particularly for law enforcement. The Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act has no clause about mandatory training. So that leaves it up to the states. Well, we already know there's a handful of states that don't even have a statute. The ones that do, some of them are pretty bare. Kentucky's guilty. We have no mandated training in our state statute. What does that mean? It means law enforcement does not have to elect to get trained. And as a matter of fact, they might even object to it being suggested because it costs money. So I offer my services free of charge. That gets some people. Other folks are like, oh, we still don't have time for that, you know. I will say, here in Louisville Metro Police, there's 1,200 officers. They elected to make it mandatory for their officers. And so I trained all 1,200 officers. Wait for it, when I was pregnant. So they got trained. It was only an hour and a half, but I'll take it. Lexington Police also elected to make it mandatory. They made it a 4-hour mandatory training for their officers. And then the chiefs of police, there's 300 or so chiefs and command staff here in Kentucky, and their training academy made it mandatory for them. Yeah. So we trained all of them. And that was 4 hours. So we're making inroads, but it's not mandatory. So it's really going to the people and sort of shopping it around and saying, this is important. And sometimes, unfortunately, it takes a really awful case hitting the news for folks to realize it's happening in your community. Question?
Yeah, I have comments, I guess, and a question also. When you were telling the story about the girl whose parents sold her, it made me think, you know, on Sunday night we watched that video about localization and how it's damaging local communities, and I was thinking, those parents didn't sell her just because they thought it was great to sell their daughter into the sex trade. They did it because they were desperate and because they were being offered something that they needed in return for their daughter. And so when we talk about local problems like human trafficking, they do have local, workable solutions that are based on what poor people need around the world. I like this theory called the empty bowl
Okay, first of all, your comment was very good and very insightful. And let me add to that, that sometimes the parents even think this will be better for their children. Because you have a trafficker who says, I have more money than you and I can give them a good education. I'll take care of them. I promise. So in some cases, they truly believe they're giving their child over to better circumstances. And so there's just a lack of understanding that this is very risky. So yes, very, very good observation. In regards to outcomes, I would guess that at Catholic Charities alone, of these 91 cases, of the 138 victims, we've probably served about 80 something of those out of our office. So I can speak mostly about those cases. I've only had 2 go back to be vulnerable again and be trafficked again, per se, go back somehow. And I have to say, and I don't know if this is why, but both of those cases, they had very severe mental health needs that were never properly addressed because either they would not take medication or their mental health needs got more and more severe because of their trauma. And so I don't know if that's why, but I know that as I was sort of thinking about these 2 victims that ended up being victimized again, that was the common factor that I saw. Most victims are very resilient. Very resilient. The girl that I told you from the Caribbean who was trafficked, for 11 years, I can't even imagine. She is now 24 years old. She's trying her best to get her GED. She's having a really hard time because she doesn't have a good command of English. So it's really hard for her to read and write. She was never allowed to go to school. She had a boyfriend that she thought would be the family that she never had, and they had a baby, and then he abused her. And so she's alone with this baby now, but she is pushing on. She's doing really good. They need a lot of support. So one thing that we don't do is we don't say, you only have 5 months of services. We don't say that. Even if we only have 5 months of money, we don't say we only have 5 months of services. Again, I beg and plead. So we have some clients we've been serving for the whole 4 years. Other clients have been super resilient, and we've been able to cross those challenges really quickly. And most clients do not want to burden you with serving them. They want to be independent as soon as they can. That's been my experience. So usually, as soon as they're able to, they're ready to go. So some of them, it takes a few months. Usually, foreign nationals have very serious immigration legal issues, and that can be really problematic for becoming gainfully employed. So those cases tend to take the most time and take longest for the victim to sort of become self-sufficient. I hope that helps. So there are some challenges. I've mentioned probably some of them, but trafficking cases are so complicated. There's sex cases and labor cases, adult victims, child victims, foreign nationals, domestics, men and women. So that causes a whole lot of questions about, who are you going to serve? And we choose to serve every kind of victim, even though funding is limited sometimes. There's the issue of awareness, because you must raise awareness in the community or you're not going to get the cases reported to you. So it's almost like what comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? You gotta do some education in order to get the victims reported to you, right? So that's really, really important. And then there's the question of really communicating and networking with local professionals. Here in Kentucky, we have what we call human trafficking task forces. And I know there's several communities nationwide that have these. We have 6. 3 of them are in very urban areas, Louisville, Lexington, and northern Kentucky near Cincinnati. 3 of them are more rural, Bardstown, Moorhead, and Somerset. And I know there's some task force members here today. I'm going to embarrass you and ask you to stand up for me. Task force members, I see some of you. Thank you. The reason that I want you to know who they are is because they can talk very intelligibly about this issue. And so if you have questions that come up, I hope that you'll see Lorraine and Joetta afterwards and talk to them also because they're involved. So maybe you need some local task forces. That's where local police come together with service providers and attorneys and government officials, and we talk about what's happening in our community and how to train folks and how to serve victims to really It's been a model that's worked really well for us. Of course, limited funding is a challenge. I mentioned some of our funding problems where we've lost a lot of federal funding, but you just get creative. At desperate times call for desperate measures, right? So I beg and plead more than usual. Sometimes it can also be difficult to get access to services for victims. Sometimes they don't qualify. If you have an undocumented immigrant victim, there's lots of services they don't qualify for, so that can be really challenging. It can be challenging to even access the services that they do qualify for. So those are just some things that can be difficult. And ultimately you have to have folks who are willing to sort of take the lead, and that can be a challenge. These task forces that we have, I'm not in charge of those. Folks in the community and that community have taken ownership of those and take leadership responsibilities. And that can be difficult at first, but it's really, really necessary in order to have a local movement and do some community organizing. You have to have folks who are willing to step up and be the leaders at the beginning initially, and then over time, hopefully folks will share that responsibility. I do think that despite our challenges, we've had a lot of successes in a short space of time. Most folks really don't think trafficking's happening in Kentucky, and unfortunately, I have to say that it is. And I've already mentioned the number of victims that we have. 31 victims have received certification. Certification is basically this pretty letter from HHS that says you now qualify for services like refugees, which is a huge thing for an undocumented immigrant victim of trafficking. They can now, once they're certified, that means they've gotten a T visa as a trafficking victim, they can then qualify temporarily for health insurance, food stamps, other services that helps them on their road to self-sufficiency. And I do think even though it's a small number, 17 charges as indictments, that's a success for us, because when we started this work, there were 0. Actually, as of last year, there was still only like 2 or 3. So we've come a long way in the past year. So this is what I hope to spend a little bit more time on. I try to end on an up note because it's kind of a depressing topic. Makes you want to have an adult beverage or 5. So you should have in front of you this little half sheet. I hope you'll get one if you don't have one in front of you that says, what can you do? This is for you, but this is also for you to share with folks. I have some that are more specific to Kentucky, but I made this very general one, which you can just photocopy and use in your community. So I hope that you will. So this is not Kentucky specific. There's a lot of things that you can do and things that you can challenge folks around you to do. The first I think you're already doing today, which is getting educated on the issue, right? Get educated. Know what trafficking is, what it looks like. Know that it's not just foreign nationals being moved around, right? That it can happen to lots of vulnerable folks. Educate your circle of friends, people that you work with, people that you know, because you know people that I'll never know, right? You might be the only one that can educate them on this issue. And if you think it's important, they're more likely to think it's important, right? They're not going to think it's important because I think it's important. Organize an event or have a speaker come share. Sometimes that's all it takes. Just talking one time. Because it's not that folks don't care, it's that folks don't know, right? I have found that when people know about this issue, they really do care for the most part. There's exceptions to that, but not usually. You can certainly fundraise and donate to those organizations that help victims. You can purchase fair trade products, and I was so thrilled. See, I didn't even know this, that CRS Fair Trade, y'all doing some good work on the fair trade. So fair trade, completely connected to the issue of labor trafficking, right? I won't talk about that ad nauseum because I could, but you've probably already talked about it some. Support fair trade. Have your organization have fair trade. Your church, your business. Say, I want fair trade coffee. Buy fair trade gifts. Give them away to folks, right, for birthdays and Christmas. And some of these products are even made by freed slaves. So you're helping them stay out of exploitation by purchasing things that they've made. Encourage other folks, because other folks don't know. They don't know what these 2 little symbols mean. Tell them that they can find fair trade at Kroger. Folks don't know that, right? I tease on that it's hidden in the rice cakes aisle, which is why no one ever sees it, right? The coffee, the fair trade coffee is like in the health foods aisle. I don't go there often, but often enough. But that's where you might find it from time to time. And I'm going to harp on the next one, to not purchase anyone's body for sex. This is such an important issue to educate folks on. I mentioned that this is demand-driven. We must educate our young people. Right? I don't think we understand the consequences of, in particular, the commercial sex industry. I believe that a lot of folks that purchase prostitution or go to strip clubs, I don't think many of them understand that there are trafficked women there or that they're contributing to this huge social injustice. I think they think in an isolated way it's very innocent. And I just don't think folks know, and we must educate our young people. In particular, about that issue. One quote, my friend Russ Funk, who runs this organization called Men's Work, that educates men about getting involved in violence against women prevention efforts. What he says is, you know, unlike coffee and sugar, women do not have a fair trade stamp on them. Right? And is that true? There's no stamp on their thigh. Right? I like that saying because it's really true. You cannot know. So what's the best way to know you're not participating? Don't participate at all. And being an observant and responsive community member, and I have on here the National Human Trafficking Hotline and Resource Number. It's an 888 number. That's a great number because it's nationwide. Anyone can call it. You know, in Kentucky, they have my phone number at the hotline, so if it's in the Louisville Metro or other places in Kentucky that we serve, they'll call me when they get that call. In your brochure that you should have the hotline number also in here. You know, so if you come across a victim or a potential victim and you're not sure, maybe just give them the hotline number. Let them know that that's a place that they can call if they need help. You can call it yourself and ask for help or report a case if you're not sure who else to call. Right? But I encourage you to share this information with other folks and certainly advocating for legislative change. Maybe having safe harbor laws. Safe harbor keeps minors from being charged with prostitution crimes, and instead they're treated as victims. Appropriately so. You know, having a victims fund in your state. There's lots of things that can be advocated for at the state level. And so I think I'm done with my piece, and I want to open it up to more questions because I see that there are some more. Okay, go ahead.
I do want to ask whether here or in Kentucky or nationwide, is there a need for special protective measures for caseworkers?
The question is about the need for protective measures for caseworkers. People ask me that a lot, if I ever feel, you know, endangered by this work. The thing about trafficking work is certainly it's connected to criminal activity, of course. So that's, of course, dangerous in and of itself. But you never know who the traffickers are connected to, and that's pretty scary. Sometimes it's connected to large organized crime groups. Sometimes it's just one family or one couple. Trafficking folks. So I think there's just always a need to be safe. I don't know of any, we don't have a particular protocol. We tend to just try to be safe. We had a case recently involving some Latinos here locally, and it was a very dangerous case involving, you know, a cartel, I believe, and some drug activity. And so when I was talking to Spanish news folks about this issue, I tended to disguise a little bit more who I was, right? So I just try to take somewhat protective measures, and I think a lot of people in this work do. I think it's more dangerous in other countries where you don't have law enforcement behind you, and here we really do, right? We have a lot of protection so I think there's certainly danger more in other countries, and the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime has some great protocols in regards to combating human trafficking internationally. I would like to go back and comment on the gentleman who's mentioned sporting events. And let me also just broaden this to include, we know a lot of commercial sex and sex trafficking is happening, not just at large sporting events, but it certainly is, where lots of folks gather, where they're sort of out of their typical daily life, conventions, right? Visitors to a city, a lot of times they'll look up the commercial sex available in that community before they go there. Internationally, it's known that United Nations and NATO peacekeepers are some of the worst perpetrators of commercial sex, and they're out there fighting for the good, right? So sometimes it's about opportunity, right, and position, not just always sporting events, but certainly that's a big part of the problem. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
When you said it wasn't obvious, but the attitudes are such that I'm afraid there's a great deal of it going on in a rural state that you can't detect. What's your thought?
Oh, we can't really know. But what I believe, unfortunately, the truth is that it's happening in every single community. And most folks would agree, no matter what your political views, that the most egregious seems to be sex crimes against children and child sex trafficking. Most of us can unite on that issue. There's division and issues of immigration and other things. But I, from doing this work, truly believe that our children are being bought and sold in every single community. And I'll just give you one small example. In very small town Kentucky, Richmond, which is outside of Lexington, mom and dad, American families selling their 13 and 14-year-old daughters for sex in front of the local movie theater. What? If that's happening here, it's happening everywhere, and it's a sad and sick thing. Yeah, other questions or comments? Yeah.
I'm wondering if you're available to train other dioceses how to set up the kind of services you're doing down here.
Well, my executive director is not here, so I say yes. I'm sure he would say yes too. I'm sure. The only issue is ever resources, but I'm sure we would be glad to if we can. Yes, so please let me know if I can be helpful in that way.
One other observation is, it seems to me that the psychology, what you think, is this similar to rape in the way that victims often don't want the law to be involved, or do you see any similarities between victims of sex crimes or trafficking in terms of rape and how they react legally and emotionally?
I'd say it's more similar maybe to domestic violence because you have that interpersonal relationship with the abuser, right? Which you might not have in a rape case per se, but the attitudes towards law enforcement, I think with foreign nationals, you can see that they wouldn't trust police because they're not trustworthy in their home country, so there's issues with that. Domestically, the big issue with law enforcement and not wanting to report seems to be that they've been criminalized by police before, right? They've been in the system for truancy, for runaway, right? And they're abused and neglected kids, and they feel like if I go to the police, they're going to tell me it's my fault and that I'm a bad person. And so they might be hesitant to report in that way. But yeah, there is a connection to other crimes, and the trauma is very, very similar. For those of you who might not have been connected so much to the trafficking issue before or might not know who's in your community doing this work, I do have a couple of lists that are national lists, and I've highlighted the Catholic agencies doing some of this work in different communities. And so if you want to come take a look at this, you're welcome to do that afterwards. We also say that you have some posters on your table. I hope you'll take those and put them up somewhere where people might be able to utilize the information on it. There's additional posters up here, and there's also extra handouts with those action steps on it. Please take everything that you want. We have a unlimited, but no, we don't have an unlimited budget, but take everything that's up here. We want you to have it. My business card is up here also. And I'm happy to speak, especially if you live in Puerto Rico or an island. I'm happy to come anytime. Anybody here from Guam, American Samoa? Okay, I think that's the end of the time. Thank you. So, I just want to